Few people know that Peru has had one of the most violent armed conflicts in recent history. Almost 70,000 dead and missing have been left by the war between the communist guerrillas of Shining Path and their leader, Abimael Guzmán, and the Quechua and rural communities and the Peruvian state, led by figures such as Alberto Fujimori.
Today we are going to tell you the true story of terrorism and armed communism in Peru. This is Reynaldo Carrillo Vilches speaking, and this is La Nueva Enciclopedia.
The history of Shining Path cannot be understood without first knowing about its founder, Abimael Guzmán. Manuel Abimael Rubén Guzmán Reynoso was born on December 3, 1934, in Molindo, Arequipa, as the illegitimate son of a merchant who took years to acknowledge him as his son. His childhood was marked by successive abandonments. His mother left him with a grandfather who barely cared for him when he was 8 years old, and he spent his childhood moving from house to house, until at the age of 15 his father formally accepted him as his son in Arequipa. There, a Chilean stepmother named Laura Jorquera gave him something resembling family warmth for the first time. It was there in Arequipa where something was sparked in him. While he was a high school student, he witnessed a popular uprising against the government of General Manuel Odria, which left 29 dead. Abimael doesn't take part, but he watches, fascinated, imprinting in his mind images of a heroic struggle that will never leave him. By 1952, he enters San Agustin University in Arequipa to study law and philosophy. There, a communist professor introduces him to Marxism. At the university, he reads Lenin, Stalin, and especially Mao Zedong, whose thesis of peasant revolution and guerrilla warfare would become his political dogma. Then in 1962, he arrives in Ayacucho as a university professor, where he methodically builds a network of training and recruitment at the university. In those years, he also falls in love with Augusta de la Torre, a student 11 years younger than him, whom he marries in 1964. And when she finds out that she will never be able to become a mother, she decides to abandon her studies and devote herself completely to the cause and political activism. According to several researchers, without Augusta and the unconditional support she gave her husband, it is very likely that Sendero Luminoso would never have existed. By 1965, the couple traveled to China for 6 months to train at the advanced school of the Chinese Communist Party, where they learned to organize ambushes, make explosives, and carry out armed raids. When they returned to Peru on the eve of the Cuban Revolution, a flame to start a revolution in their homeland was burning in their souls. In the midst of a complex situation within the Peruvian left, Abimael Guzmán and his close circles unified and officially adopted the name Communist Party of Peru in 1969. On the shining path of Mariátegui, known by the shorter name Shining Path. During the 1970s, a climate of mobilizations and strikes was created in Peru against the military governments of Velasco Alvarado and Morales Bermudez. Abimael and his circles take advantage of this situation to become more organized and grow during these years.
Now then, let's continue with the history of terrorism.
The subversive in Peru? The ideological approach of Shining Path is that 20th century Peru was a semi-feudal society dominated by a land-owning oligarchy that kept the indigenous peasantry in a state of servitude inherited from colonial times. Meanwhile, so-called North American imperialism was plundering Peru's natural resources, and the Peruvian state was nothing more than an instrument that perpetuated this domination. The only way out of this reality, according to the Maoism applied to Peru that Abimael Guzmán advocated, was a prolonged people's war. Surround the cities from the countryside, destroy the bourgeois state down to its foundations, and build on its ruins, quote, a people's republic of new democracy, reflecting, according to some, an early cult of personality that he was building before coming to power, even proclaiming himself to his followers as, quote, the fourth sword of Marxism, that is, the historical successor of Marx, of Lenin, and of Abimael Guzmán, already known for his subversive positions. He is arrested 5 times between 1964 and 1979, but no government ever takes definitive measures. Each arrest ends in just a few days with Abimael being released. In March 1980, Guzmán convenes the party's Central Committee to what will be a historic session that will last 11 days. With an almost biblical speech, he convinces the members that it is time to start the armed struggle to build the country, a new Peru. On the night of May 17, 1980, the very night when Peru is preparing for its first democratic elections in 12 years, a small group of members of Shining Path, who will now be called Senderistas, go out to the polling stations in the district of Chuchi in Ayacucho. And what do? They burn the ballot boxes. More than a military act, it was a very symbolic gesture. Despite the commotion it caused in Ayacucho, in Lima only a brief note was published in the newspapers about what happened. The next day, it spread more as a rumor than as news, but no one understood that this small act of subversive disobedience was the announcement of something much bigger that was just beginning for Peru. In this way, 1980 would mark the beginning of what some have called the armed conflict in Peru. At the time of the burning of the ballot boxes, Shining Path was neither an army nor a conventional guerrilla group. It was mainly a party structure with compartmentalized cells, strict internal discipline, a vertical chain of command, and a promotion system based on political loyalty. Now, from the beginning, and especially in this year, 1980, the party had embraced the possibility of armed struggle as the only possible mechanism to seize power. So from its inception and throughout its trajectory, the members of Shining Path would handle different types of weapons, ranging from bladed weapons like axes, machetes, and knives, to homemade explosives, car bombs, and explosive charges attached to infrastructure. They would also train to some extent in the use of firearms, obtained mainly by robbing police and military facilities. Weapons such as G3 and AKM rifles, pistols, revolvers, and shotguns. The militants of Shining Path called themselves People's Fighters, and their operational units were called the Main Forces, the Local Forces, and the Militias. This depended on their level of training and the geographical area to which they were assigned. The central leadership of the party, headed by Abimael Guzmán, from hiding in Lima, was the one that made the most important decisions, the strategic decisions, and all those concerning the zonal committees in the countryside that carried them out. The first 2 years of this armed conflict, which began between 1980 and 1981, would pass almost unnoticed. For the rest of the population of Peru, Shining Path would operate during these years exclusively in the most isolated communities of Ayacucho, with a strategy that involved a mix of propaganda, harassment, and violence to strengthen the group's control in this region. In this sense, in its first actions, Shining Path set out to bomb municipal buildings, steal weapons from remote mines, and attack civil guard posts in the interior of Peru, where historically the presence of the state was so weak that a dozen fighters were enough to impose a new order. The government of then-President Fernando Belaúnde greatly underestimated the Shining Path group at that time. Peru's own Minister of the Interior even confused the Shining Path in 1981 with leftist organizations that had already ceased to exist years earlier. The turning point in this conflict came on March 2, 1982, when a commando of 33 Shining Path members assaulted the Huamanga Penitentiary Center right in the city of Ayacucho. There they killed several guards and freed 304 prisoners, 70 of whom were Shining Path militants. It was the first time that Shining Path made national headlines in Peru, and the first time that the Peruvian state realized it was facing something qualitatively different from a peasant protest or any leftist organization it had seen before. After these events, Fernando Belaúnde declared a state of emergency in 5 provinces of Ayacucho, and in December of that same year, 1982, he ordered the intervention of the armed forces. That moment marks the beginning of the bloodiest stage of the conflict. The army launched itself into a war that, according to experts, it didn't fully understand. in a territory it didn't really know, and against an enemy that was not only cunning, but also knew how to blend in with the civilian population. The episode that best reveals the nature of Shining Path took place on Sunday, April 3, 1983 in the Ayacucho village of Santiago de Luca, Lucanamarca. Days earlier, the local residents themselves, tired of the abuses of Shining Path, had lynched Olegario Curitome, who was a local leader of the Shining Path organization. And the response of Abimael Guzmán, which was personally ordered by him from the central leadership, was that a column of 60 Shining Path members, armed with axes, machetes, knives, and firearms, would enter the villages of Yanacolpa, Adacara, Yachua, Liachua, Muila Cruz, and Lucanamarca. There, they killed 69 people, including 18 children. The youngest of those killed was 6 months old. Most of them died from axe blows to the head, and others were burned with boiling water. Years later, Abimael Guzmán would acknowledge this massacre, and he did so without remorse, saying, and I quote, "In response to the use of armed bands, we responded forcefully. There were excesses there, but everything has two sides. Our problem was to deliver a forceful blow to make them understand that it wasn't so easy." According to historians, the town of Lucanamarca is the definitive breaking point between Shining Path and the peasantry they supposedly came to liberate. And the response of the Peruvian state to these events between 1983 and 1986 has been categorized as chaotic and controversial. For its part, the army, faced with the impossibility of distinguishing between a Shining Path member, a peasant, or a civilian, chooses to suspect everyone. The military bases of Los Cabitos and the Huanta Naval Base became detention and torture centers where hundreds of people disappeared without any accusation or trial, under the presumption that they were members of Shining Path. For example, in the community of Acamarca, in August 1985, an army patrol killed 69 civilians, most of them women and children, whom they doused with gasoline and burned to hide the massacre. By 1986, Lima's prisons, such as Lurigancho, El Fronton, and Santa Barbara, were housing hundreds of Shining Path prisoners. And in addition, they served as training and recruitment schools for the inmates, with their own rituals inside the prisons, their own hierarchies, and revolutionary chants. Those same prisons will be the setting for the next episode that will mark Peru forever. On June 18, 1986, the Shining Path prisoners in the prisons of Lurigancho, El Fronton, and Santa Barbara carry out a coordinated riot, in response to which Alan Garcia's government orders the armed forces to retake control of the prisons. The result is a brutal massacre. While the Peruvian state cited the complexity of the situation, the truth is that from 1986 and until 1992, Shining Path would expand towards Lima. At the same time, the government of Alan Garcia, who took office in 1985, with promises to provide a political solution to the conflict, was sinking into hyperinflation that reached the historic record of 7,650% annually. Shining Path exploited the state's collapse to enter Lima's neighborhoods, public universities, and Guayaga's coca-growing valleys, forming a tactical alliance with local drug traffickers to protect coca growers, with the region's drug trafficking in exchange for protection for the growers. In July 1990, amid economic chaos and the state's inability to contain the violence and guarantee public peace, the enigmatic figure of Alberto Fujimori, an agricultural engineer and son of Japanese immigrants, comes to power with the promise of imposing a hardline policy to restore political, social, and economic order in Peru, in the face of what he called subversive terrorism. In Fujimori's view, Alan Garcia had fought against Shining Path with the army, but without intelligence operations. So Fujimori created DINCOTE, the National Directorate Against Terrorism, an elite police unit that would focus on infiltration, tracking members, and analyzing seized documents, instead of simple scorched earth military operations. Operations that cost many civilian lives, but were not very effective when it came to dismantling the guerrilla organization. In April 1992, amid an extremely complex social and political situation, Fujimori dissolved the Congress of Peru in order to concentrate more power, and with that, declared total war on Shining Path. That same month, he legally reinforced the so-called self-defense committees, also known as peasant patrols, giving them weapons and training so that the rural communities themselves could fight those who supposedly came to liberate them. It is precisely in that context of an all-out offensive that Shining Path, far from retreating, carried out their most violent action. In February 1992, they assassinated Maria Elena Moyano, deputy mayor of Villa El Salvador, who had dedicated herself to organizing the local residents against the Shining Path guerrillas. They riddled her with machine gun fire and then blew up her body with dynamite in front of her children and her community. By mid-1992, the Shining Path guerrillas had carried out more than 1,000 attacks with explosives, and Peru was, according to several international analysts, the country with the highest terrorist activity on the planet at that time, even surpassing Colombia. On July 16, 1992, another deadly attack occurred. It was 9:15 at night when 2 car bombs loaded with 400 kilos of ANFO detonated on Torrada Street, in the heart of Miraflores, the most prosperous district of Lima. The result was 25 dead, over 200 injured, and 300 families impacted. The buildings collapse and glass flies blocks away. Torrada is the moment, according to several analysts, when the people of Lima realized that the war, which they thought was something distant, had reached the gates of the City of Kings. As journalist Santiago Rocangliolo records, the Torrada attack also accelerates Guzmán's downfall, since the horror is so great that Peruvian society and the people of Lima would, for the first time, demand a decisive response. A response to this problem. The state was bound to give this response sooner or later. On September 12, 1992, just 2 months after the Torrada car bombing, agents of the GEN, that is, the Special Intelligence Group of the police, led by Major Benedicto Jimenez, stormed an apartment in the Surquillo district of Lima. There, they found Abimael Guzmán Reynoso, the man who had spent 12 years in hiding, who, although he never set foot on a battlefield, organized and ordered thousands of deaths and violent operations from apartments and safe houses. While his militants were dying in clashes with the army, along with Abimael Guzmán, they also captured and arrested his second partner, Elena Iparaguirre, known as Comrade Miriam, and several other members of the Shining Path leadership were arrested as well. During the investigation into the Peruvian guerrillas, they found videos of the so-called President Gonzalo drinking whiskey and dancing at private celebrations. These images were used by the state to destroy the myth of Abimael Guzmán as a revolutionary ascetic, a narrative that was promoted by many of his followers. For her part, Augusta de la Torre, Abimael's first partner, and the woman without whom Shining Path probably wouldn't have existed, had already been dead for 4 years. She had passed away in November 1988 under circumstances that still have not been clarified. The official version from the Shining Path Communist Party said that she died of a heart attack, but her body was hidden for days. And the internal accounts within the party are so contradictory that, according to some of these testimonies, several Shining Path members suspect that Abimael Guzmán may have been involved in her death. They're all just hypotheses, but the question of how she really died still has no definitive answer. After the fall of Abimael, Fujimori enacted a repentance law in November 1992, which offered reduced sentences to those who turned themselves in and cooperated with the justice system to help finish neutralizing the Peruvian guerrillas. Between 1993 and 1994, more than 6,000 members of Shining Path, mostly mid- and low-level leaders, took advantage of this mechanism. It is the largest mass desertion ever recorded in the history of an armed group in Latin America. What ultimately fractures Shining Path from within is, paradoxically, Abimael Guzmán himself. In 1993, from his cell at the Callao Naval Base, he signed a public letter requesting peace negotiations with the Fujimori government. For his followers in the countryside who had buried their dead, believing in loyalty to the revolution, that was an unspeakable betrayal and the definitive defeat of their struggle. The blow that the Peruvian state dealt that year against Victor Abimael Guzmán not only helped to definitively neutralize what the government called subversive terrorism in Peru, but according to some, also helped to legitimize the Fujimorist decision to dissolve Congress in 1992. But despite Abimael Guzmán's call to lay down arms, not everyone in Sendero was willing to abandon the armed struggle. The war in Peru was still ongoing, with a faction of Sendero led by Oscar Ramirez Duran, also known as Comrade Feliciano, who rejected the agreement and symbolically expelled Abimael Guzmán from the organization to continue the armed struggle. It was in this phase that Sendero shifted towards drug trafficking, not only as a source of funding, but as a genuine economic activity. During this phase, it increasingly abandoned the idea of being an ideological guerrilla and became something closer to an armed mafia until the capture of Feliciano in 1999, 7 years after the blow against Abimael. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Peru, which worked between 2001 and 2003, collected testimonies from thousands of survivors. It publishes a final report stating Sendero Luminoso started the armed conflict, which left about 69,280 people dead or disappeared, with the group responsible for 54%. What about state forces like the army, police, or paramilitary groups? Like the Kalina group of Fujimori, responsible for 46% of those fatal victims. "75% of the total victims of this conflict had Quechua as their mother tongue, showing that the main victims of this conflict were members of the indigenous communities that Sendero claimed to dignify. 40% of the deaths occurred in the department of Ayacucho. And according to these studies, the economic cost of the conflict between 1980 and 1988 amounted to more than $9 billion. Abimael Guzmán will die on September 11, 2021, at the Naval Base Hospital in Callao, at the age of 86, serving a life sentence. The Peruvian authorities offer his family members the chance to claim the body, but no one does, so he is buried in an undisclosed location to prevent his grave from becoming a place of pilgrimage or some kind of symbol. The man who wanted to be the fourth sword of Marxism in human history ends up without a grave, without his name engraved on any stone, without any place where his followers can bring him flowers. What little remains today of Shining Path in the valley of the Apurimac, Ine, and Mantaro rivers has almost nothing to do with the organization that Abimael Guzmán founded in the classrooms of Ayacucho. The brothers Victor and Jorge Quispe Palomino, sons of the perpetrators of the Lucanamarca massacre, lead a faction that keeps the name but long ago abandoned any ideological or even political pretensions. In reality, it is an armed wing of Peruvian drug trafficking that charges tolls to coca producers and ambushes military patrols. The revolutionary idea that left a conflict with almost 70,000 dead was ultimately reduced to a business, but the wound left by the conflict in Peru remains open in a deeper sense. On one hand, thousands of Quechua-speaking families from Ayacucho, Huánuco, and Junín are still waiting for the Peruvian state to find the bodies of their dead in mass graves that no one has finished excavating. On the other hand, it's the wound of a latent civil war. Fujimori argued that he restored the human rights of millions of Peruvians with his war against the insurgency. To this day, most of the reparations recommended by the Truth Commission in 2003 still have not been fulfilled. And in Peruvian political discourse, the words terrorist or Shining Path member are more present than ever. Shining Path no longer shoots, but it is still very much alive in the collective memory and in the Peruvian narrative. Thank you all very much for watching this video. Just a reminder that you support us a lot by leaving your comments, giving a like, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with all your friends, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. This was Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking. This is La Nueva Enciclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support and many blessings to everyone.